So let me take you into the first part of today's presentation. The meaningful, the magical, and the memorable, and the convergence between those. Meaningful, the first leg of the stool here, meaningful. So when we're in a space or in a place, navigation is more than just finding your way around there. It's also understanding the purpose and significance of this place and whoever make it their habitat. So, and the habitat, even if it's a temporary, making this space become a place because we add some value and meaning to it. So our nonlinear journey through this habitat is much more than what surrounds us. It's what happens within us. There's a lot of talk about immersive storytelling, about immersive experiences at the moment. And a lot of that is really, it ends up being a discussion about what surrounds us. And rather what we walk through than what happens within us to make a difference and create another kind of relationship with that specific space. So even I, in integrated storytelling by design, I talk a lot about audience, and we think about it now in terms of audience and visitors coming to our places. Everyone is our cherished guest. But what if we change that kind of thinking and we start thinking of people as inhabitants, even temporarily? So they make the place come alive by living in them, like by exploring them, and not just as a visitor. The living narrative of these inhabitants, be they temporary or not, is actually what makes the place come alive. They're telling about the place. So one of the things we need to do in terms and if we want to make this work, is also make sure that they have gateways into understanding what this place is. So I'd like to introduce a principle dubbed the Rosetta Design Principle, where we have something, even small elements, that helps us understand what is this place, what is this world all about, even though it might seem foreign or alien. So we can bridge the known with the unknown. So think of the pyramids, think of the thousands of years of ancient pharaohs. For many years, this was really not something that we knew that much about. And then just a couple of, back in the 1800s, a French researcher figured out that this stone actually was the bridge into those thousands of years of the different kingdoms and the different times of the pharaohs. So the Rosetta Stone is very special because it holds, it has the hieroglyphs, but nobody really understands what it was. At the same time, it has ancient Greek symbols. So by comparing those, he actually unlocked the language of the hieroglyphs, because there was something there, the ancient Greek language, that was understood. And that opened up this vast world of thousands of years of Egyptian past story. And obviously that led to a lot of different opening up to the imagination and the knowledge and having a completely different understanding of what Egypt was and what it is. So the question here is really, what will you do to let your inhabitants understand and live out the meaning and value of your place? What is the Rosetta Stone of your spatial design? What is that thing that bridges the known with the unknown? The second leg here is magical. And where meaningful is often something that people think of in terms of cultural heritage and museums and so forth. Magical is of theme parks and fantastic worlds. And the whole sense of a place being magic is invoked by the fantastic and the mysterious, mysteries of the unexplainable. So we might know that this is a trick, but we can't figure out how the trick was done. We suspend our sense of disbelief and give in to the illusion and immerse ourselves, not just with what surrounds us, but in part inside of ourselves and become part of the place. One of the things in these times we talk so much about the metaverse and the virtual realities and so on. What is more truly magic than being allowed to wield the magic? So what happens when we let our visitors or temporary inhabitants become wizards? So they achieve the ultimate agency. This whole talk about metaverse, about virtual reality, we have to talk about agency at the same time. But why should we mirror the real world, when we can actually say, why have virtual reality when we can have virtual super reality? I want to be able to move the sky around. So the virtual and the hybrid worlds where virtual and digital comes together allows us to create these new dimensions. They can have their own laws of physics and reality. Again, we need to bridge into them so people understand what they do and what it is. And why is everything upside down? So the question in terms of magic to you is, what magic will you not only present to your audience, but what magic will you bestow on the inhabitants of your place? Now, the third leg here is that of the memorable. And as experienced designers, regardless of what kind of experience we do, our mission is much more than designing that specific moment or framing that specific moment. What we do actually is we create memories that last and become part of people's consciousness and subconsciousness. We paint memories. Memories consist of a lot of different things. So the memory architecture is a construction of memory types, multi-sensory design of inputs and outputs. And so we have taste and smell and light and sound, and we have different ways to invoke our physical memories and different ways of invoking our cognitive memory. But there's a foundation for this lasting memory to be with us. Not just, this tasted like this, or this smelled like this, or aha, I just figured this and this thing out. There is a deeper foundation. And for that lasting memory, there's a deeper meaning that we can achieve by doing deeper theming rather than just what happens on the surface. So deep theming is what creates a connection with people. So you can say if the experiential elements of the heartbeat, deeper theming is the soul, is something that's even deeper than the story. To look at something like that the apocalypse, as it's presented in so many different ways in popular culture today. So on one hand, we have the heroic drama of saving the world from the apocalypse, and on the other side, we have this freedom of the post-apocalyptica, when basically we lost. And what do we do when we've lost? But this is a very popular television show as there is out there right now. In my opinion, very successful adaptation of the game The Last of Us. So the game itself was very favored because of its very connective storytelling and the connection between people. And whenever we throw people in strange scenarios like this, be it in The Walking Dead or Aliens or whatever. It's really not that much about the zombies and the aliens, all of that. It's really about what do people do in extraordinary settings. The theme, though, in this, what happens after the apocalypse, what happens after we lost. So on one hand, the theme itself is about accepting loss and learning humility. And it's also about reclaiming that agency and identity. Life continues, and hopefully we have learned something from that experience. And sometimes history will repeat itself. So dig even deeper than the story and think about what is the deeper theme that creates a deeper connection with your inhabitants in your place. Like now we've seen with zombies and could be with aliens, but everybody can relate to loss and moving on. So these three things are not separate items. They converge. They all come together. And that's part of what can make a set of design rules, instead of design guides, the thoughts and mindsets that actually is not just anchored in a theme park or in a museum or in a historical site or in a virtual space, but actually all of these values can come together and create new and exciting spaces and places. So keep this in mind. Places are merely empty spaces without the living narratives reflecting the lived lives of their inhabitants. Going back to the inhabitants actually making the place come alive and add value to it. And that is a perfect cue from me to David.
Hi, everyone. So yeah, I'm going to pick up on this idea of complementing the deeper theming to the spatial narrative. And that needs unpacking, and I shall try. Okay, so I'm going to, Klaus, if I can share screen. Yeah, there you go. There we go. Hi, can you all see that? All right, so, whoops. Let's stay with the plunge. Let's stay with earth, air, water, and human life, all separate for a second, okay? So this is, in many ways, for me, the marker of immersion and pre-immersion. And the way we are in different kinds of spaces, whether they're on earth, underwater, in water, or in air, kind of define the way we feel about the world and also what's possible for us. So this is the sort of opening template, and also a frozen moment in time. So everyday living is spatial. We form our connections in private and public spaces. Memory is spatial. We remember by recalling the spaces we have lived and traveled. A memory palace of a type takes us through time. The memory palace was a strategy for memory enhancement, which used the familiar visualizations of spatial environments in order to enhance the recall of information. Also known as a memory journey, a journey method, memory spaces, or mind palace technique. I'm trying to think whether I talk about that. No. So I think the first reference we have of this is of Cicero, the Roman senator, who had an extraordinary memory, would give intensely long speeches in the Roman Forum, and he shared his way of remembering. This is still used today by people who have to give talks and don't have PowerPoints. And it's a way of putting in a visual place. So you imagine a place that you lived, and in each room, it could be any place that you're very familiar with. And in each room, you put a piece of content and you link it to that room. And then you walk yourself through that memory of the place that was very familiar to you. And now you're able to sort of attach the content you want to remember in the order you wish to remember it. Immersive and spatial. So narrative is immersive, performance can be immersive, and experience can be immersive. And all of those involve some kind of spatial relationship to the viewer, user, or player. The relationship between space, narrative, and memory. Well, a story has a setting, and a setting has a story. A narrative is more than the interpersonal, it's the extrapersonal, which is everything else. It's vibe, it's ambience, it's atmosphere. This is obviously the realm of experience design, and like what Klaus was talking about, the deeper theming. So we have songs about this, like a house is not a home, and like on about our relationship of space to people who were there. But we remember them and we can recall these stories because of the places we were in. And to, signal Joe Pine, what makes these experiences meaningful is that they're both memorable and ultimately transformative. Another use of, again, back to the Romans, I don't know why this morning it's Rome, but the genius loci, which is their sense of space. This is where the Romans would in fact have a different, statue of a god or theme spaces in a specific part of nature or part of values or spirituality. So it's the thing that gives a character of a place that stems from its use and experience, and also a kind of spatial narrative design. And we see this in landscape architecture, we see this in home decor, whether it's feng shui or some other type of theming. We are always taking our containers and making them have a meaning. And then later that meaning is partially what's memorable, and part of that meaning is what predetermines what happens in the space. And so space can play multiple roles in a narrative. It can be the source of symbolic meaning. It can be an object of emotional investment, a means of strategic planning, a principle of organization, and ultimately a supporting medium to the narrative. This is an image from a Punch Drunk Enrichment project where they, in the middle of a school, create this grandma's home where the children hear stories in a traditional direct address, sharing and talking with the kids. And at some point, it also becomes an experience when that refrigerator door opens and they enter a dream space. So the spaces that blur the mere textual, graphic, cartographic, and multimedia storytelling. Spaces can be organized as stories and stories as spaces. This is a larger deep dive, which would be when we do this course in Copenhagen, of all of the different experience design triggers and senses that can be invoked in building a connection to a space. So these are just the beginning of it. Proximity. Space can be close, space can be intimate. Spatial narrative is not framed narrative. So it could be immersive. You could have this cow's nose straight up against your own, or you can imagine it. The frame that you're looking at on the screen indicates a kind of breaking of the fourth wall, as we say in the theater, but a kind of interaction and immersion promise. And if this was a 3D projection screen, it might have an effect visually. If it included sound, it would enhance the senses. If it included an actual live event, similarly, right? So the space that is broken between the viewer and the content is actually part of the design, one of the interesting kind of aspects of spatial design. And this is kind of the larger thought, sort of like not theoretical, but the larger frame. We're used to stories, we're familiar with stories that are told in time, cinema, theater, reading a book. It's not timeless. You begin and you experience the story from a beginning, middle, and an end, with perhaps a lot of diversions in the middle, perhaps a number of subplots that bifurcate the main plot. But we have a sense of momentum, and that is an unspoken contract between the traditional storyteller and the audience expecting to understand and follow and be reeled in by the narrative. Whereas spatial narrative requires a different dramatic structure. If we focus on a spatial narrative as opposed to a time-based narrative, we need a different template, because the forward momentum of rising and falling along a line like we have in traditional storytelling is really not available to us, because we might have multiple entry points, for example, rather than to begin at the beginning. As David Copperfield by Charles Dickens begins, I shall begin at the beginning. That doesn't really work for spatial narrative. I might begin at the side, and you might begin at the door, 2 blocks away. It's not time-based. So solutions for rethinking narrative in space. Well, one template is the branch narrative, where the story expands outward with extensions that offer audiences and players choices. And nobody necessarily experiences the same narrative. They experience different branches of the narrative. Repeat viewers might even not ever get to the bottom of all of the different branches that have been designed. This creates a sense of the space and the wayfinding, and this is where entries and doorways and portholes and rabbit holes with clues and Easter eggs of different kinds. This is the mechanism. It doesn't look like a branch narrative on the ground. On the ground, it just looks like a series of passageways or a series of invitations, all of which seem to be going hopefully somewhere, but you're never sure, because the experience is more immersive and essentially more spatial. Open story world. Well, this is unlike the branch narrative. Here, it is just a space that is seemingly passive to be explored, right? We have this experience often when we go into historical buildings and we try to find the markers and the clues that would indicate what, and where we should be, where that gravesite is, where that stabbing took place, where anything that happened that was relevant to the space. So here is a space where it is not so much about the branch narrative, but it's more about the artifact, the object, and the synchronizing of participant to space. The exploring of the space is here much more obvious. Nonlinear narrative. Well, nonlinear narrative simulates a kind of a chaos, but it's not necessarily chaotic, where the connections are not the internal logic they're an internal logic, not a sequential chronology. So here you might see echoes and reverberations, metaphors, symbols that reappear. You might be in an active case of discovery and looking for clues, the world becoming a kind of a Sherlock Holmes, episode. Just recently watched an old film with George C. Scott and Joanne Woodward called They Might Be Giants. I don't know if anyone knows this film. In it, there's a mental patient who thinks he's Sherlock Holmes. And the doctor, George C. Scott is the Sherlock Holmes, and Joanne Watson, Joanne Woodward, I slipped. Joanne Woodward plays his Dr. Watson, actually a psychiatrist working with him. He wanders around the city looking for clues in everyday spaces. He provides the narrative through his madness and through his adopting of Holmes-like behavior. Well, in a nonlinear narrative, the audience is put in the position of the discoverer, the detective, the sorter, the curator of content, which is distributed ambiguously, meant to be confusing, but makes the hunt for content the event. It makes the character, the audience, the character. And so the nonlinear, the open world, and the branch narratives are three ways of developing narratives in space that do not require time. Certainly you're spending time in them, but your sense of time is somewhat outside. You're somehow outside of time. You're creating, one has an experience which is not unlike being lost, which is not unlike being in a city you don't know your way around, or being in the midst of a language you don't comprehend, or being in a natural setting where you're looking to track, the clues of how you got there to find the way you got back. None of these are necessarily calming, peaceful experiences, but there is a deeper theming, to pick up on that is about a deeper connection to the event, the narrative, and the space. And that combination in a spatial narrative can be intensely compelling and, most importantly, deeply memorable. It can encode so that you actually might forget weeks of repetitive time, or even time-based narratives. But the thing that you actually experience with all of your senses, which is what we'll get into in a later development of the theme of spatial narrative, that is what makes a memory memorable, right? Is how it encodes in not just the eyes and the ears and the mind, but actually in the senses, because we are more than our left brains. Our right brains are waiting to be invited. And in a spatial narrative, the right brain is actually takes the wheel. And this is my final thought from a wonderful book on screenwriting. All tales at some level are a journey into the woods to find the missing part of us, retrieve it, and make ourselves whole. And I think that's the real offer of a spatial narrative. We might find ourselves in it rather than by analogy, but by experience.